This is critical thinking for the cardiovascular anatomy lab, and let's look at the questions first. So this is on coronary circulation. This is on openings or the valves between chambers and between the chambers and blood vessels. And then this asks you again something about the chambers. And again, here is another question on the valves. So let's go to the first one, and the question asks, which areas will not be affected if the artery shown here was thrombosed? So first you need to identify the artery. So this artery is the posterior interventricular artery. And you can see this is showing you the anterior surface of the heart up here. So everything in bright is what is seen anteriorly. So this is the anterior interventricular or left anterior descending, this one here. So we are talking about this one, which is the posterior interventricular artery. It is called interventricular, so therefore it means it supplies the it'll supply both ventricles, and it lies in the interventricular sulcus. It also supplies the interventricular septum. Now how does it do that? So if you look at the interventricular septum, so if you look at the two ventricles, and this is the interventricular septum. This septum it's like a wall like this between the two chambers. So the right one on this side of the wall and the left one on that side. From the anterior aspect, the anterior interventricular artery sends branches which supply the septum. So they come down this way and they supply the interventricular septum. From the posterior aspect, the posterior interventricular artery sends branches which go up to supply the septum. So the posterior interventricular supplies the septum this way. So therefore, the posterior interventricular artery supplies both the right ventricle and the left ventricle, and it also supplies the interventricular septum. The only structure here which is really far away from the artery, and again if we erase all this and look back, is this right atrium, which is here. So this artery will find it very difficult to send long blood vessels to go and supply the right atrium. The right atrium is supplied by direct atrial branches from the stem of the right coronary artery. So therefore the answer to this question is the right atrium. So it's very important for you to know what, first of all, to be able to identify the arteries, the main arteries, their branches, what areas they supply. And similarly, you should know about veins. You should know what arteries they lie with, which areas they drain, and finally, where do they open. Let's look at this question now, where it tells you in the cardiac cycle, closure of the cusps of opening B prevents blood from. And even if the question did not mention in the cardiac cycle, and suppose it just said closure of the cusps of opening B prevents blood from, you must take it for granted that I'm talking about cardiac cycle in this case, because we usually tend to talk of normal events unless mentioned otherwise. So in this case, I've been specific just to show you how to interpret the question. So first, let us identify the opening. So this is the heart, this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, the interventricular septum, the left atrium, left ventricle. So A is the tricuspid opening, B is the pulmonary opening going into the pulmonary artery, C is the mitral or bicuspid opening, and D, this small one here, is the aortic opening which goes into the aorta. Now, the question asks, what happens when these cusps close? Over here, B closes. Blood flow is always one way. So it will go from the atria into the ventricles. So from the atria into the ventricles, then from the ventricles into the arteries. On the right side into the pulmonary artery, on the left side it will go into the aorta, or aorta meaning systemic circulation. So that's one. So here, when the cusps close, when B closes, so that means blood has already gone into the pulmonary artery. The purpose of closing this is, what it will do is it will prevent blood from backtracking or back flowing into the right ventricle. So therefore, this is the right answer. In the cardiac cycle, when these cusps close for opening B, it prevents blood from backtracking into the right ventricle. So we are talking about the right side So and we can't here it's backtracking into the right atrium obviously is not right. Entering the aorta again is not right. And again, if you were thinking along these lines that it prevents blood from flowing, if these cusps are closed, it prevents blood from flowing into the pulmonary artery. Remember, in the cardiac cycle, blood is meant to flow into the pulmonary artery. So the cusps are open, and that's when it will flow into the pulmonary artery. When they close in the normal cardiac cycle, the idea is it prevents blood from going back. So therefore, this is not the right answer, and this one is the right answer. Now let's look at the next one, where it asks you, deoxygenated venous blood enters which of the following chambers? So the first thing is you need to identify these chambers. And again, if you look at this, this is in the anatomical position. So A, the atria are above. So A is the right atrium, B is the right ventricle, C is the left ventricle, and D is the left atrium. And this groove here, where you see this area here shows you the interventricular sulcus, the anterior interventricular sulcus with the great cardiac vein and the anterior interventricular artery in this. Now, venous blood enters the atrial chambers. So that is one important thing to know. So it'll enter the right atrium, and venous blood also enters the left atrium. The difference being that pulmonary veins which enter the left atrium bring oxygenated blood back. So therefore that rules out the left atrium, and the only answer available is right atrium, which does get deoxygenated blood because it gets blood through the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, the coronary sinus, anterior cardiac veins, and so on. And all of them bring back deoxygenated blood. So therefore, the correct answer is A. Let's look at the next question, which asks you that if stenosis of which valve will affect blood leaving the ventricle and entering the systemic circulation. So here you must know that when blood leaves the ventricles, which circulation does it go into? So when blood leaves the right ventricle, so this is the right ventricle and this is the left ventricle. When blood leaves the right ventricle, it goes into the pulmonary artery to the lungs. So that is pulmonary circulation. So from the right ventricle, it goes into the pulmonary circulation. From the left ventricle, when blood leaves and goes out, it goes into the aorta. And aorta is part of systemic circulation. So it goes into the aorta, and that is part of systemic circulation. So therefore, it will be a valve which will be in the left ventricle and which will prevent blood from leaving the left ventricle and going into the aorta if that valve was stenosed. So in other words, you have to identify the aortic valve. So now let's look and see how we can identify the valves. So A is the pulmonary valve, B is the tricuspid, C is the mitral or bicuspid, and D is the aortic valve. So D is the correct answer. So therefore D is what you would choose. It's a good idea for you whenever you look at these images to look very carefully at how these valves look. Notice the pulmonary and the aortic, which are also called the semilunar valves. Look at them. Look at these cusps, how different they are, because when they close, they are like little cushions because the sinuses fill with blood. Whereas look at the atrioventricular valves, which is the tricuspid and bicuspid. They have leaflets, and attached to the leaflets are these chordae tendineae. So it's a good idea for you to form in your mind or in your an image of what structures look like, and you can sort of label it whatever you feel like in your head, so that you find an easy way to identify these structures. So this is another way that you could be asked questions about valves.